I'd like to tell you about the time when the importance of multiplication went from here down to here. My wife and I were serving among an unreached people group on an island off the south coast of China. And their language, there's no school you can go to. Their language hasn't been reduced to writing. So they make do and kind of force it onto Chinese characters, but it doesn't really match the grammar. So their language really doesn't have a writing system. And so I had this real sophisticated strategy. I figured I would go out and I would start by looking for 2-year-olds, engage them in conversation, and then gradually work my way up to 3-year-olds and so on. So I was out in a village pursuing this pattern, and it wasn't working out very well, because on this particular day in this particular village, the only person that I could see was this old lady. So I went up to her and introduced myself. I said, "Grandmother, how old are you?" Now this is fine. This isn't an awkward questionnaire because they honor age. And she kind of bowed up, a little bit, and she said, "I am 97 years old." Now this lady was real short. She came up about to my waist. This people group are the shortest people group in all of China, and she was short even for them. And at that point, I'd pretty well exhausted my vocabulary, so I sort of waited for her to say something. And fortunately, she was good at gesturing, at body language. So she looked up at me and she said, "You are very tall." And tall was a new word for me. So I said, "Yes, I'm very tall." So to myself, I'm going, tall, 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 tall. And then she looks up at me and she says, "Your skin is very pale." I could tell, what she was saying by her motions. So I said, "Yes, my skin is very pale." So I'm going, tall skin, pale, tall skin, pale, tall skin, pale. And then she looked up at me and she said, "Your nose is very big." Nose was a new word for me. So I said, "Yes, my nose is very big." And I'm going, tall skin, pale nose, tall skin, pale nose. And my head's about to explode from new vocabulary. So I'm looking for a way out of the conversation before I hurt myself. And so I reach in my pocket to pull out a tract that's in Chinese. And so she says, "No, I can't read." And I said, "And your son?" She said, "My son can't read. No one here can read." And suddenly I felt very helpless. I'm standing here face to face with this woman who, except for her age, is typical of this people group that we had come to reach. And I was helpless to do anything. I couldn't refer her to another believer or a church because there weren't any there. I couldn't give her materials to read because she couldn't read. I couldn't refer her to Christian radio or television because there wasn't any in her language. I was absolutely helpless because obviously I didn't have the language skills to share the gospel. And then I tried to console myself with the thought that eventually I would learn the language and I could share with people like her the good news of the kingdom. And then I realized that even if I led one person a day to the Lord, from that day till I retired, it would be about 15,000 new believers. That wouldn't even be enough to keep up with population growth in this people group of 7 million people. And then I became even more discouraged when I realized really what we didn't need was just converts. We needed new churches where these new followers of Christ could continue to grow in their faith. And planting a church is an entire different thing than just leading someone to the Lord. So I began to imagine what would be the best case scenario that I could possibly imagine. And the best case scenario I could possibly imagine was me leading enough people to the Lord and discipling them and training them to start new churches, enough to have 20 teams of people. I was thinking 2 people on a team, so these 40 people really trained to go out and start churches, and that they would start a new church every year. And I thought, okay, 20 teams to get just a minimum start of what would be needed here. It would take 250 years at that rate. I thought, wow, I'll have to get really young church planners because they're going to be getting old in 250 years. Clearly, I began to understand here, not just here, that multiplication is the only way that the job would be done. Only making disciples who make disciples, only planting churches that plant churches would lead to this people group becoming reached. When I had that conversation, there were about 85 believers on that island. Today, there are close to 700,000, well, over 700,000 believers on that island. That could only happen because disciples were made who made disciples. Churches were planted that planted churches. And now it's a reached people group. Multiplication is the only way for the kingdom to make significant advances in places of darkness.